It's good to be back with you for week 2 of Sweeter Than Chocolate, Hebrews 11. I hope you're enjoying the sweetness of the Word and that you're learning how to let the study flex. Today, we're going to focus in on Abraham and Sarah. But before we do that, I want to take a little bit of time to review the big picture. Remember, one of my goals for our time together is that by the end, we're all comfortable with the big picture of the Bible. Obviously, there are limits to what we can do in 11 weeks, but I'm confident that by the time we're done, we can all walk away with an understanding of the main framework of God's story. We're not going to go for all the nitty-gritty details. We want the building blocks, the big pieces, so we can grab a hold of what's going on in the story. We want enough framework so that when we pick up the Bible to read it, we'll have an idea of context wherever we turn. Sound good? So, as we go, be aware of what makes sense to you as far as remembering the big pieces. And of course, I'll break it down to let you know where I think important markers are along the way. I like to think of the main characters and events in the Bible like I would big cities on a map. So, if I'm traveling, for instance, from Chicago to Chattanooga by car, I know that I'm going to hit Indianapolis, Louisville, and Nashville along the way. Now, I don't know all the little cities in between, but if you told me that a particular city was located between, say, Louisville and Nashville, I'd have a pretty good idea where you were talking about. If I've got the main markers, the big picture, I'll be able to get to the details a lot more easily because I'll already have some context. This is exactly what we're trying to do here with the Bible. So let's focus on the big pieces for now, and then we'll be able to continue to fill in more and more of the details along the way, both now in this study and in our years of study to come. Because when you get a handle on the big mile markers, you'll be building a firm foundation for study. So last week, our big markers were creation and Noah. If you have those, you're doing well. In between them, you can probably remember that God first created Adam and Eve. Their children, whom we meet in Hebrews 11, are righteous Abel and his brother, not so righteous Cain. The next two major characters we encounter are Enoch and Noah. Both, we're told, walked with God. It was at the time of Noah that God sends the flood because of the sinfulness of mankind. And after the flood, things change. People are now allowed to eat animals. The fear of man comes on animals, which makes sense given the fact that people are now allowed to eat animals. Life on earth is, in a sense, rebooted. After Noah, we know that God repopulated the earth through Noah and Mrs. Noah's 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and their wives. The people of Israel will be descendants of Shem. And the next big character on the scene is Abraham. Let me just read through the main text we're talking about today. I'm going to be starting in verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, there was born, even of one man, and him as good as dead at that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable is the sand which is by the seashore. All these died in faith, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, "In Isaac your descendants shall be called." He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. Did you notice how many times the word promise shows up in this section? Abraham and Sarah lived in the shadow of a promise of things to come. We see forms of the word for promised or promise showing up 5 times in the verses I just read. This is a high-frequency word in this section that is key to the text. So what's the promise? Abraham is promised a land and a seed. We see partial fulfillment of both, as he did live in the promised land, but he lived there as an alien and a stranger. It was never his land. We also see the birth of Isaac, who is the son of promise, but not the ultimate son of promise who is yet to come, Jesus Christ. Abraham and Sarah have great promises, but the key to the promises is the one who stands behind them. He is the one who has both the authority to make promises and the power to keep them. And we see that Sarah and Abraham consider God and believe. Still, you ever wonder how Sarah and Abraham hung in there? Year after year after year after year. Or how all of the people of faith so far have lived lives of faith. So let's look at the text. It's clear they weren't hanging on to empty emotion or just hopeful feelings. They responded in active faith. And they had what I'd like to call directional resolve. They decided they were going to go God's way. Like Abraham setting out from his physical country, all of these people of faith have chosen God's path. The text tells us they desire a better country. And here's where I want to land today. What does verse 15 tell us? It says, "And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return." But we see that they didn't. Abraham and Sarah stayed in Canaan, as did their descendants, and they continued on with God. My question to you and to me today is this: how is our directional resolve? You know, when we start looking back over our shoulders, it becomes harder to obey. The text tells us if they had been thinking about where they had come from. And the Greek word used here is almost always translated as remember. If they had been remembering the old land, they would have had opportunity to return. How much energy do we waste in considering bad choices? How much better off would we be if we just decided in advance that we are all in with God and will walk His ways in all situations? What if we just decided up front in matters of obedience, having directional resolve, we're going to go God's way? Does God have your yes in advance? Or do you try and keep Him at a safe distance with a maybe? maybe God. Which, by the way, is never a safe move. Clearly, Abraham and Sarah made some missteps along the way. Sarah got ahead of God, I believe, in offering Hagar to her husband as a second wife. But even in that, they were not turning around from following God. Their answer to God throughout their lives was yes. Next week, we'll look at the ultimate obedience of Abraham in offering Isaac. But for now, I'd like you to consider a few questions as we close our time together today. If you're in a group, take a little bit of time to consider how important it is to decide on obedience in advance. When was a time that you were able to obey because you decided beforehand that you would? Which example of faith have you learned the most from so far? I know we've only been going a couple of weeks, but which of the characters that we've looked at has most impacted you? What have you learned, and how are you applying it? And before you wrap up, don't forget to post your thoughts on either of the above questions or any other application point you've had from your study this week. My friend, obedience is a choice. And I want to close this week with the words of Joshua to the people of Israel as they were settling in the Promised Land. He said, "If it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourself today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Who will you choose to serve this week?